Hello, and welcome to Revenge Blaze Your Home for the most gripping stories of justice, family drama, and the ultimate payback. We specialize in bringing you tales where the truth always finds a way to the light, and where those who betray the one they love finally face the music. We have an incredible story for you today, and trust me, you do not want to leave the channel because the twists in this one are absolutely shocking. Without further ado, let's dive right into today's story titled, He Kicked His Adopted Mother Out, but the Tables Turned in 5 minutes. At 62 years old, I thought I had understood the full spectrum of human betrayal, but nothing prepares you for the cold bite of steel against wood at 6 in the morning. I am Rosemary, and for 32 years I built a life on the foundation of a promise I made to a helpless infant I found shivering in a cardboard box at a desolate gas station. I raised him with every ounce of my soul, paid for his elite education, and even emptied my savings of $80,000 to fund his lavish wedding last year. But as the frantic pounding echoed through my quiet home in suburban Boise, the warmth of those memories evaporated into the freezing Idaho air. I pulled on my robe, my heart hammering against my ribs, and opened the door to find a uniformed officer holding a stack of legal documents that looked like a death warrant for my sanity. "Eviction order," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. My breath hitched. My name was printed on the header in stark clinical black ink, transforming me into a trespasser in the very house my late husband had left to me. Across the street, standing by the curb, I saw them. My adopted son and his wife were leaning against their car, watching the scene play out like a long-awaited premiere. There was no grief on his face, only a sharp, predatory satisfaction. His wife called out, her voice cutting through the morning mist with a sweetness that felt like venom. "You should have cooperated when we gave you the chance, Rosemary." My son didn't even flinch. He just adjusted his watch and muttered, "Pack your bags. We have movers scheduled for noon. This house is ours now." I didn't scream and I didn't plead. I looked the officer in the eye, my hands trembling as I pointed to the signature line. "Can you show me who filed this?" I asked. He hesitated, flipping to the final page, and as his eyes scanned the petitioner's name, his entire demeanor shifted. His face turned a ghostly shade of pale, and he looked at me with a sudden, sharp recognition that sent a chill down my spine. The name on that paper wasn't just a betrayal, it was an impossibility. If you believe that blood is thicker than water, this story will make you question everything you know about family. How far would a son go to steal from the woman who saved his life? And what did the officer see on that paper that changed everything? If you are ready for a journey where the truth is louder than any lie, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications. You won't want to miss a single second of how I turn the tables on the people who thought I was already defeated. Garrett was not always the cold-blooded stranger standing across the street with a smirk that could freeze boiling water. At least, not in the sepia-toned memories I have carefully preserved over the decades. My mind often drifts back to a biting January night 32 years ago at a desolate Texaco station on the edge of Boise. I was just a young woman then, traveling with my late husband Arthur Mitchell, when a faint rhythmic whimpering caught our attention. It wasn't the sound of a stray animal. It was the fragile cry of a human soul abandoned in a damp cardboard box behind a stack of rusted oil cans. When I peeled back the flaps, I saw him, a tiny, red-faced infant shivering in a thin, stained blanket. In that moment, something in my heart didn't just break, it reconfigured. We didn't see a legal liability or a burden. We saw our son. We named him Garrett Mitchell, a name that felt strong, a name we hoped he would grow into with honor. The early years were a whirlwind of sleepless nights, strained finances, and the kind of exhaustion that makes you forget your own middle name. Arthur and I were far from wealthy. He worked double shifts at the lumber mill while I spent my days filing endless stacks of property deeds at the county office, a job that taught me the terrifying power of a single signature. Every penny we scraped together went toward Garrett's comfort. I remember one summer when the heat in Idaho was so oppressive you could fry an egg on the sidewalk. Our old air conditioner had groaned its last breath, sounding like a dying tractor before finally giving up. Instead of buying a new one, we used that money to enroll Garrett in a prestigious summer science camp because he had shown a fleeting interest in telescopes. We spent 3 months sweating through our shirts, fanning ourselves with grocery store flyers, and laughing about how we were basically living in a giant wooden oven just so he could learn about stars he would eventually forget the names of. Garrett was a clumsy, energetic child who had a knack for finding trouble in the most creative ways. I fondly recall the great flower incident when he was 5. I had left him alone for exactly 3 minutes to answer the phone, only to return to a kitchen that looked like a winter wonderland in the middle of July. He had managed to open a 5-pound bag of all-purpose flour and was busy skating across the linoleum, convinced he was an Olympic athlete. When I asked him what on earth he was doing, he looked at me with those wide, innocent eyes, the same eyes that now glare at me with malice, and whispered that he was just trying to make the house look fancy like a castle. I couldn't even be angry. Arthur and I spent the rest of the evening covered in white powder, sneezing and laughing until our sides ached. We were a team, a family forged not by blood, but by the shared struggle of making ends meet and the joy of watching a little boy grow. However, as Garrett entered his teenage years, the cracks in the foundation began to show, though I was too blinded by maternal love to see them as anything other than growing pains. He started to develop a taste for things we couldn't easily provide: designer sneakers that cost more than our monthly grocery bill, and the latest gadgets that seemed to become obsolete the moment they touched his hands. We wanted him to have the world, so we worked harder. When he got into an expensive private university, Arthur took on a part-time job as a night security guard, his knees aching from years of labor just to ensure Garrett didn't graduate with the crushing weight of student debt. We were proud, perhaps too proud, of the man we thought we were molding. We saw a future leader and achiever, a man of character. We didn't realize we were fueling a sense of entitlement that would eventually consume him. The real shift occurred after Arthur passed away 2 years ago. The house became too quiet, the hallways echoing with the absence of his laughter and the steady rhythm of his carpentry tools. Garrett, who had been working as a mediocre real estate agent, suddenly became very interested in the logistics of the estate. He began visiting more often, but his conversations weren't about my well-being. They were focused on the market value of the property and the status of the trust fund Arthur had painstakingly built. Then came Whitney Vance, a woman who walked into our lives with a smile as bright as a searchlight and a heart as cold as an Idaho winter. She was the daughter of a distant acquaintance, and Garrett was instantly smitten. I wanted to be the supportive mother-in-law, the kind you see in those cheesy television commercials. So when they announced their engagement, I didn't hesitate. I dipped into my retirement savings, handing over $80,000 for a wedding that was more of an exhibition than a celebration. I watched them exchange vows in a garden filled with imported lilies, believing I was securing my son's happiness. Whitney, however, had a particular way of making me feel like a guest in my own history. She would suggest redecorating projects that involved throwing away Arthur's handmade furniture, or hint that the house was too much for a woman of my age to handle. Garrett started echoing her sentiments, his voice losing the warmth of the boy who once skated on flour. The humor was gone, replaced by a sharp transactional tone. They started talking about investments and modernizing the portfolio. Phrases that sounded like a foreign language to a woman who just wanted to grow her roses in peace. I noticed things going missing: old family photos moved to the attic, Arthur's favorite armchair, replaced by a sleek, uncomfortable monstrosity that looked like it belonged in a dentist's office. It was a slow, deliberate erosion of my presence. They weren't just waiting for me to leave, they were actively erasing the woman who had spent 32 years ensuring they had a place to call home. Looking at Garrett now standing next to Whitney on that sidewalk, I realized that the little boy I rescued from the Texaco station died a long time ago, replaced by a man who views his own mother as nothing more than a stubborn obstacle in a real estate transaction. I took a deep breath, feeling the biting chill of the polished oak floorboards beneath my bare feet, and asked Officer Curtis to bring that document closer to the light. My heart was still performing a frantic tap dance against my ribs, but 30 years of working in the county archives had ingrained in me a certain clinical detachment when it came to paperwork. I knew that in the eyes of the state, a person was only as good as the ink they left on a page. The officer, a man whose weary eyes suggested he had seen more family squabbles than a divorce court judge, hesitated for a second before stepping onto my welcome mat. He tilted the clipboard, allowing the pale morning sun to illuminate the bold letters at the top: Emergency Protection Order and Notice of Eviction. My eyes didn't linger on the legal jargon. I went straight for the petitioner's signature at the bottom. Who exactly is claiming that I am a threat to this household, Officer Curtis? I asked, my voice holding a steady edge that seemed to surprise him. Across the street, Garrett Mitchell was still leaning against the hood of his overpriced German SUV, checking his reflection in the tinted window as if he were preparing for a photo shoot rather than the displacement of his own mother. Beside him, Whitney Vance was busy on her phone, likely live tweeting her victory to whatever shallow social circle she inhabited. They looked like a couple out of a high-end catalog, polished, successful, and utterly hollow. It struck me as absurdly funny in a dark, twisted way that the $80,000 wedding I had paid for had essentially bought the front row seats for my own ruin. I almost wanted to shout across the lawn and ask if the imported lilies had been worth the perjury they were currently committing. Officer Curtis cleared his throat. The petition was filed by Garrett Mitchell, listed here as the primary resident and property manager. He's alleging a history of emotional instability and recent verbal threats that made him and his wife fear for their safety. I felt a dry, cynical laugh bubble up in my throat. Me, a threat. The most dangerous thing I had done in the last decade was accidentally using salt instead of sugar in a batch of brownies for the neighborhood bake sale. Those brownies were hard enough to be used as construction materials, and Arthur had joked for weeks that I was trying to rebuild the garage one dessert at a time, but they certainly didn't constitute a record. Look at that signature line, Officer E, I said, pointing to the messy scrawl that was supposed to represent Garrett's formal consent. Having spent decades verifying property deeds, I knew Garrett's handwriting better than I knew my own recipe for pot roast. He had a very specific way of looping his letters, a habit he'd picked up in middle school when he tried to forge my name on a failing math grade. I had caught him then because he'd made the loop too wide, and 30 years later he'd made the exact same mistake on a document meant to steal my life. This signature wasn't his usual script. It was practiced and stiff. It looked like someone had tried very hard to mimic him. I glanced at Whitney, who was now primping her hair, and a cold realization settled in my gut. Officer Curtis frowned, his brow furrowing as he pulled a magnifying lens from his belt. He looked at the paper, then back at me, then over his shoulder at the couple across the street. "Ma'am, you're saying this isn't his signature?" I nodded firmly. "I'm saying that Garrett is too lazy to fill out a 3-page petition on his own, and he's certainly not precise enough to sign it like that. But more importantly, look at the date of the alleged threat. It says last Tuesday at 4 in the afternoon. I felt a spark of hope ignite. Last Tuesday, I wasn't even in Boise. I was at the annual Pioneers of Idaho luncheon at the community center, where I was being honored for my 30 years of service. There were at least 50 witnesses, including 3 retired judges and the mayor's wife. Unless I've developed the ability to teleport, I couldn't have been here threatening anyone." Officer Curtis shifted his weight. He was starting to see the holes in the story. He looked back at the couple, his expression hardening from procedural neutrality to professional skepticism. "Garrett," the officer barked. My son jumped, nearly dropping his phone. He walked toward us with a swagger that didn't quite reach his eyes, Whitney trailing behind him like a shadow. "Is there a problem, officer?" Garrett asked, trying to sound bored but failing to hide the tremor in his hands. "We have a court order. My mother needs to be out by noon so we can begin the transition. It's for her own good, really. She's been confused lately." Confused, I thought about the time last month when I had successfully recalculated my entire tax return manually because the software had a glitch. I looked at him, the boy I had rocked to sleep, and I didn't see my son. I saw a man who had sold his soul for a zip code. "Garrett," I said quietly, "did you sign this petition in front of the court clerk?" He hesitated, his eyes darting toward Whitney. She stepped forward, her voice high and shrill. "Of course he did. We don't have to stand here and be interrogated by a woman who clearly needs medical intervention. Officer, do your job and clear the house. We have a professional cleaning crew arriving at 1, and I won't have them delayed because of this drama." She had that tone used by people who think a high credit score entitles them to treat the world like their personal staff. Officer Curtis didn't move. He looked at Garrett, ignoring Whitney entirely. "Mr. Mitchell, I'm going to ask you one more time. Is this your signature? Because if the court finds out that this petition was filed under false pretenses or that the service of process was tampered with, we're not talking about a civil matter anymore. We're talking about a crime." Garrett's face went a sickly shade of gray. He opened his mouth to speak, but Whitney pinched his arm so hard he winced. "We're done here," she snapped, grabbing Garrett's hand to pull him back toward the car. "We'll call our lawyer. This is harassment." As they retreated, I saw the officer jot something down in his small black notebook. He looked at me with a flicker of sympathy. "Ma'am, I have to follow the order as it stands for today, but I'm noting the discrepancy in the signature and your alibi. If you have proof of where you were last Tuesday, you need to get it to the courthouse before the clerk's office closes at 5. I nodded, the gears in my mind already turning. "I have the program from the luncheon officer, and I have the mayor's wife on speed dial." I felt a strange icy calm wash over me. The fear was gone, replaced by cold, calculated precision. They thought they could use the law as a hammer to crush me, but they forgot that I was the one who knew how the toolbox was built. I looked back at my house, my beautiful solid home, and I knew that by the time the sun went down, the movers wouldn't be the only ones busy in Boise. Garrett and Whitney had started a fire, but they had no idea that I was the one who owned the extinguishers. The tires of my vintage station wagon crunched over the gravel driveway, leaving behind the only sanctuary I had known for 3 decades, as Whitney Vance's triumphant laughter faded in the rearview mirror. I didn't look back at the looming silhouette of the house, or the 2 predators currently standing on its porch. Doing so would have been a waste of precious emotional energy. Instead, I gripped the steering wheel and set my GPS for the older historic district of Boise. My destination was a small brick building that smelled of floor wax and ancient lawsuits, the office of attorney Howard Vance. Howard had been Arthur's closest friend and our legal advisor for longer than Garrett had been alive, and more importantly, he was a man who believed that a person's word was a sacred bond. Driving through the streets of Boise usually filled me with a sense of peace, but today every traffic light felt like a personal insult. To calm my nerves, I reached for a stale peppermint in the glove box and thought about the sheer irony of the situation. Garrett and Whitney probably expected me to drive straight to a cheap motel and spend the afternoon weeping. They saw a 62-year-old woman as a fragile relic. They had completely forgotten that I had spent 30 years navigating the corridors of the county records office, a place where I had earned the nickname the Bloodhound for my ability to find a missing tax lien in under 10 minutes. I pulled into the cramped parking lot behind Howard's office. The office hadn't changed since the 1990s, the same faded green carpet and the same secretary Martha who had been guarding the front door like a Cerberus in a floral cardigan. When I walked in, Martha looked up. Rosemary Mitchell. You look like you've just gone 10 rounds with a mountain lion and won by a hair, she remarked. I gave her a tired smile and asked if Howard was available. She pointed toward the back office and muttered, "He's just finished his third cup of decaf. Go on in before he decides to throw his printer out the window." Attorney Howard Vance looked exactly like a man who spent his life translating legalese into English. He was surrounded by stacks of paper that reached his shoulders. When he saw me, he pushed his chair back with a loud groan and stood up. Rosemary Arthur always said that if you ever showed up here with that specific look on your face, I should clear my schedule. What has that boy of yours done now? I didn't waste time with pleasantries. I sat down and laid out the events of the morning. As I spoke, Howard's expression shifted from concern to a cold professional fury. They used an emergency protection order, Howard mused, leaning back. It's a clever, albeit disgusting tactic. It bypasses the standard 30-day notice period for an eviction by claiming an immediate threat. If we can prove the underlying petition was fraudulent, the whole house of cards collapses. He paused, looking at me with a sharp glint in his eyes. But we need more than just your word against theirs, Rosemary. We need hard evidence that Garrett was never the resident manager, and that the deed he's likely planning hasn't been finalized. I felt a surge of adrenaline. Howard, they think they can outsmart me with apps and digital signatures, but they forgot one thing. I still have my master key to the city's physical archive annex. Before everything went digital, Arthur and I made sure every major transaction regarding this house was recorded in the physical ledgers, including the conditional clause in my husband's will. Garrett thinks the trust fund is an open vault, but it's actually a locked gate. I explained that the original deed Arthur left me contained a right of reversion, a clause stating that if any attempt was made to sell or transfer the property without my explicit consent, the title would automatically trigger a review. Howard chuckled. I remember drafting that. Arthur was a visionary. But Rosemary, you need to get those documents today. If they manage to record a new deed with a crooked notary before we file an injunction, we'll be tied up in civil court for years. I nodded, already reaching for my car keys. I knew exactly where the physical ledgers were kept in the basement of the old county building. Before I left, Howard handed me a thick file folder. Take this. It's a copy of the original probate distribution. And Rosemary. He added, his voice softening. Don't let them rattle you. You were the one who taught that boy how to walk. It's only fitting that you're the one who teaches him how to fall. I thanked him and headed back to my car, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. I stopped at a drive-thru for a massive coffee and laughed when the teenager at the window asked if I wanted a senior discount. I told him I'd take it, but only if he could guarantee the coffee was strong enough to help me dismantle a conspiracy. As I drove toward the county building, the fog was lifting over Boise, revealing a bright, clear sky. The tactical retreat was over. The counteroffensive had begun. I was a specialist with a grudge and a master key, and I was about to show Garrett and Whitney that some archives are better left undisturbed. They wanted a war over a zip code, but they were about to find out that I owned the map, the territory, and the historical records to prove it. The interior of Attorney Howard Vance's office possessed a specific aroma of ancient parchment and lukewarm coffee, a scent that usually signaled safety. Howard was currently hunched over his computer terminal as he navigated the county's secondary digital database with focused intensity. I sat in the heavy guest chair waiting for the digital gears of the Boise record system to grind out the truth. Suddenly, the old laser printer in the corner let out a series of rhythmic, mechanical groans before finally spitting out a single sheet of paper. Howard grabbed it with a flourish. Here is the anchor of their entire scheme, Rosemary. Howard announced, sliding the paper across the desk. This is a durable power of attorney document supposedly signed by you exactly 4 months ago. It grants Garrett Mitchell full authority over your real estate assets. It's the golden ticket he used to convince the county clerk that the deed transfer was a legitimate family transaction. I picked up the document, my eyes scanning the clinical language that sought to strip me of my agency. At the bottom of the page sat a signature that looked remarkably like mine, but to my trained eyes, it was a forgery. 4 months ago, I asked, a dry laugh escaping my lips. Howard, look at the timestamp on that notary seal. It says this document was acknowledged on the afternoon of October 14th. Do you remember where I was on that day? Howard leaned back as he searched his memory. I didn't wait for him to find the answer. I was on a charter bus heading to the Oregon coast with 20 other members of the Boise Historical Society. I spent the entire afternoon loudly debating lighthouses with Mrs. Gable. There is absolutely no way I was in a notary's office in downtown Boise signing away my life. I pointed to the notary's name embossed on the seal, Carla Mendez. It wasn't a name I recognized. Howard's frown deepened. Carla Mendez is a roving notary who often works with high-end real estate firms, he explained. She has a reputation for being efficient, which is often code for not asking too many questions. Garrett likely presented someone with a fake ID, or perhaps Whitney Vance performed her best impression of a doting elderly mother. Either way, this document is a serious crime masquerading as a legal instrument. The sheer audacity of the move was breathtaking. Garrett and Whitney had attempted to erase my legal existence while I was busy looking at seagulls in Oregon. I felt a surge of righteous indignation. They think they're so modern, Howard. But they've forgotten that I still have my personal logbook from the Historical Society trip signed by the bus driver. And I certainly haven't forgotten about the right of reversion clause Arthur Mitchell had me memorize like a prayer. Howard chuckled, reaching for a stale donut. That's the beauty of being old school, Rosemary. We still believe in paper trails. While Garrett is busy refreshing his real estate portal, we are going to file a lis pendens, a formal notice of a pending lawsuit. It freezes everything. He won't be able to sell a single blade of grass on that property until a judge decides who actually owns the ink. He took a bite of the donut and added, and I think it's time we give Carla Mendez a reason to reconsider her career choices. We spent the next hour drafting an emergency motion to vacate the eviction order. I watched as Howard's fingers flew across the keyboard. We weren't just fighting for a house. We were fighting for the memory of Arthur and the dignity of a woman who had been treated as an inconvenience. I thought about Garrett and wondered if he realized that in the real world, the go-to-jail card wasn't just a piece of cardboard. Rosemary, Howard said, pausing to look me in the eye. This is going to get difficult. Once we file this, Garrett and Whitney will be cornered. When people like them are cornered, they don't apologize. They lash out. Are you ready? I stood up, smoothing the wrinkles in my skirt. Howard, I've survived 30 years of city politics and a husband who thought he could fix a leaky pipe with duct tape and hope. I think I can handle a spoiled real estate agent and his wife. Let them lash out. I'm the one with the archives. As I walked out of the office, I saw Martha, the secretary, watching me with quiet admiration. She handed me a travel mug that said, "World's Best Archivist." "Give them a lesson they won't forget, Rosemary," she whispered. I thanked her, the warmth of the mug seeping into my palms. The battle lines were drawn. Garrett and Whitney were currently celebrating in my kitchen, but they had no idea that the foundation of their new life was about to be shredded by the very system they tried to manipulate. I climbed back into my car and prepared for the final confrontation at the courthouse. The numbers didn't lie, and neither did I. The heavy oak doors of courtroom number 12 creaked open at exactly 10 o'clock the following morning, admitting the suffocating tension of a long-awaited reckoning. Inside, the atmosphere was thick with hushed, nervous whispers of spectators gathered to witness what the local grapevine had already dubbed the Boise betrayal. I walked down the center aisle, my heels clicking with military precision. Beside me, attorney Howard Vance carried a briefcase that looked heavy enough to contain the tectonic plates of the earth. We took our seats at the defense table, and for the first time since that intrusion, I found myself less than 10 feet away from the people who had tried to erase my life. Garrett Mitchell sat stiffly at the petitioner's table. Beside him, Whitney Vance was a study in theatrical misery. She had traded her usual designer clothes for a conservative dark gray dress. Her hair was limp, her eyes were artificially rimmed with red, and she clutched a crumpled tissue. It was an impressive performance, the kind that might have earned her a standing ovation in a community theater. But here, it looked desperate and cheap. I almost wanted to hand her a glass of water just to see if she would stay in character while drinking. "All rise!" the bailiff barked. Judge Silas Miller swept into the room, his black robes billowing behind him. He was a man whose face appeared to have been carved out of granite. He sat down and stared at the file for an agonizing minute. "We are here for an emergency motion to vacate a protection from abuse order and a subsequent writ of possession," he announced. "Petitioner, you have the floor. Tell me why this order should remain in place." Whitney didn't wait for her attorney to speak. She stood up with a shaky, choreographed sob. "Your Honor," she whimpered, dabbing at a dry eye, "we are terrified. Rosemary Mitchell has a temper that is unpredictable and violent. Just last week, she stormed into the kitchen brandishing a heavy cast-iron skillet and screaming that if we didn't leave the house immediately, she would make sure we never left at all. I haven't slept in days. We only took the house to protect ourselves and to ensure she gets the psychiatric help she so clearly needs." She looked at the judge with practiced innocence. Garrett nodded solemnly. "It breaks my heart, Judge. I rescued this woman from a quiet life of loneliness, and this is how she repays us. We are the victims here." I sat perfectly still, my hands folded. The cast-iron skillet story was a creative touch. I looked at Howard, who gave me a subtle nod. He stood up slowly, adjusting his tie with deliberate calmness that stood in sharp contrast to Whitney's histrionics. "Your Honor." Howard began, his voice smooth and authoritative. "The only thing being brandished in that house is a coordinated web of lies. My client, Rosemary Mitchell, was not even in the county on the day this alleged incident occurred. We have already submitted the witness statements to the clerk, but more importantly, we have evidence that the entire narrative of fear was a carefully staged performance." Howard reached into his briefcase and pulled out a small silver flash drive. "If the court permits, I would like to play a short video captured by the dash camera of my client's vehicle, which was parked in the driveway during the time Mrs. Whitney Vance claims she was being threatened." The judge nodded. A screen was lowered from the ceiling and the lights dimmed. The video was clear enough to show the front porch of my home. The timestamp showed the previous Tuesday afternoon. In the footage, Garrett and Whitney were clearly visible. There was no Rosemary and certainly no screaming. Instead, Whitney was seen laughing as she took a makeup kit out of her purse. She carefully applied dark shadow under her eyes to create a tired look. Garrett watched her, saying, "Make it look real, Whit. The officer needs to see a victim. If we get the restraining order today, the house is ours by Friday." Whitney then practiced her scared face in the reflection of the window. "I should have been an actress," she muttered on the recording. The courtroom fell into a profound silence. Whitney's sob was frozen midair. Garrett's complexion turned gray, accompanied by sweat on his forehead. Judge Silas Miller leaned forward, his eyes narrowing as he looked from the screen to the couple. He didn't look like a man who appreciated amateur theater. "Mrs. Vance," he said in a dangerous whisper, "that is a very interesting audition tape. Do you have a cast-iron skillet hidden in that gray dress as well?" Whitney opened her mouth, but no sound came out. She looked at Garrett, who was busy staring at his own shoes. Their attorney tried to stammer out an objection, but Judge Miller silenced him with a single sharp raise of his hand. "This motion is granted. The protection from abuse order is vacated immediately, and the writ of possession is quashed." But the judge wasn't finished. He looked at the bailiff and then back at the disgraced couple. However, based on the evidence of a staged threat and the potential forgery, I am referring this matter to the district attorney for a criminal investigation into perjury, filing a false police report, and conspiracy to commit fraud. Garrett's knees seemed to buckle, and Whitney finally let out a sharp, strangled gasp of genuine terror. As the judge struck his gavel, the sound echoed like a gunshot, signaling the end of their masquerade. I looked at Garrett, the boy I had raised with everything I had, and felt a strange sense of relief. The theater was over. The truth was back in session. Judge Silas Miller brought his heavy wooden gavel down onto the bench with a deafening crack, a sound that echoed through the silent courtroom like a final sentence for Garrett Mitchell's hollow ambitions. The vibration seemed to shake the very foundation of the petitioner's table where Garrett sat paralyzed, his face drained of all color. I watched from the defense table, my back straight, and my expression as unyielding as the Idaho mountains. For 32 years, I had provided this man with a safety net woven from sacrifice, but today, that net had finally snapped. The Boise betrayal was no longer a headline for gossip. It was now a matter of documented criminal conspiracy. "Mr. Mitchell," Judge Miller began, his voice dropping to a low growl. "I have spent 30 years on this bench, and I have rarely seen such a brazen display of greed fueled by such amateurish execution. You didn't just try to evict your mother. You attempted to dismantle her entire legal existence using a forged power of attorney and a staged protection order. But the most damning piece of evidence isn't the video footage." The judge reached for a forensic report. "It's this. The original document you filed at the county office to transfer the title. The forensic laboratory has confirmed that while the signature is a clumsy imitation, the oily thumbprint located on the bottom corner of the document belongs to you. You were so eager to steal her home that you literally left your own identity on the scene." Garrett's mouth opened and closed like a fish stranded on a dry riverbed. Beside him, Whitney Vance was no longer the mourning victim. She was a cornered animal. She stood up abruptly, her voice shrill and desperate. "Your Honor, this is a misunderstanding. Garrett was under so much pressure. We were just trying to secure our future. You can't blame us for wanting what we were promised." It was a pathetic attempt to shift the narrative, a defense of entitlement that Howard Vance later joked sounded like someone trying to blame the sidewalk for their own tripping. Judge Miller didn't even look at her. He kept his eyes fixed on Garrett. "A future built on a forgery is a future that belongs in a cell, Mrs. Vance. Sit down before I add a contempt charge to your already mounting legal problems." Whitney collapsed back into her chair. Garrett looked at me, his eyes finally filling with tears, but they weren't tears of remorse. They were the frantic tears of a man who had realized the game was over. "Mom," he whispered, his voice cracking, "please, talk to them. Tell them it was all a mistake. We can go back to how things were. I'll fire the movers. Just don't let them do this. Nis." It was the same tone he used when he was 10 and had accidentally broken Arthur's favorite antique clock, a mixture of fear and the expectation that I would fix the world for him. But I wasn't that mother anymore. I looked at him and felt a strange pity. "Garrett," I said, my voice carrying clearly, "the only mistake I made was thinking that an $80,000 wedding could buy a man character. You tried to break me. And you're right. We are going to redecorate, starting with the locks on my front door." The courtroom let out a collective gasp, and for a fleeting second I saw a flicker of humor in Attorney Howard Vance's eyes. He leaned toward me and whispered, "I think that's what the kids call a mic drop, Rosemary." I couldn't help but crack a small smile. There was something absurdly funny about watching Garrett realize that the woman who used to knit him sweaters was now the one who had successfully dismantled his entire operation. He had treated me like an obsolete piece of software, but he forgot that I was the one who had programmed his entire life. Based on the evidence and the testimony provided, Judge Miller announced, his gaze hardening, I am ordering the immediate arrest of Garrett Mitchell and Whitney Vance on charges of grand theft perjury and conspiracy to commit fraud. I am also ordering a freeze on all bank accounts associated with the Mitchell Trust Fund, pending a full audit. Bailiff, take them into custody. The room erupted into chaos. Whitney began screaming about her rights and threatening to sue everyone. She looked less like a socialite and more like a toddler who had been denied a second scoop of ice cream. Garrett, on the other hand, went limp as the handcuffs clicked into place around his wrists. The sound was metallic and final. As they were being let out, Garrett turned back one last time, his face a distorted mask of hate. You'll be alone in that big house, Rosemary. Nobody will care about you when you're rotting in there by yourself. I didn't flinch. I watched them disappear through the side door, feeling the weight of the last few days finally beginning to lift. I looked at Howard Vance, who was calmly packing his briefcase. Howard, I said, I might be in that big house alone, but at least the air will be cleaner, and I think it's time I finally bought that new air conditioner we talked about 30 years ago. Howard laughed a hearty, genuine sound. Rosemary Mitchell, you are a force of nature. Let's go get some coffee. As we walked out of courtroom 12, the sun was shining brightly over Boise. The future looked like a clean slate. Garrett and Whitney had tried to use the law as a weapon of theft, but they had found out that the law has a long memory and a very heavy gavel. They were headed to a processing center, and I was headed home to a house that was finally, officially, and indisputably mine. 1 month later, I stood on the sidewalk of my quiet Boise street, watching the pale Idaho sun glint off the professional sold sign staked firmly in the center of the front lawn. The house looked magnificent, its flower beds blooming in a vibrant display of gold and purple. It was the house where Arthur Mitchell and I had built a lifetime of dreams, but today, it was simply a structure that had been cleansed of betrayal. I didn't feel the crushing weight of grief I had expected. Instead, I felt an incredible sense of freedom. I was no longer anchored to a memory that had turned toxic. I was finally cutting the line, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't looking back. The process of clearing out the property had been a therapeutic exercise. I sold the expensive furniture Whitney Vance had insisted on buying. I kept only what fit into a few sturdy boxes, Arthur's handmade carpentry tools, our old photo albums, and the small silver rattle we had bought for Garrett Mitchell the day we brought him home from that gas station. Everything else, the heavy curtains, was liquidated. Garrett and Whitney were currently navigating the stark reality of the Idaho correctional system, facing multiple felony counts that would ensure they didn't see a luxury SUV for a very long time. There would be no reconciliation and no second chances. Some bridges are so thoroughly burned that even the embers are swept away. Before leaving Boise for good, I made one final significant stop at the St. Jude's Children's Home, the institution that had assisted in Garrett's adoption 32 years ago. I sat in the director's modest office and handed over a certified check representing a substantial portion of the house sale proceeds. It was enough to fund a scholarship program for older children who were about to navigate the world on their own. The director's eyes filled with tears as she looked at the amount, but I simply smiled. I wanted to ensure that the children there had something Garrett never truly valued: a future built on merit, character, and the understanding that the world doesn't owe you a living just because you showed up. It felt like the best investment I had ever made, far more valuable than the $80,000 I had wasted on a garden wedding filled with false promises. As I climbed into my station wagon, which was now packed with the few belongings that truly defined me, I felt a sense of peace that was deeper than any I had known. I reached for my world's best archivist mug, took a sip of fresh hot coffee, and set my GPS for a small coastal town in Oregon. I was headed to a place where the air smelled of salt, and the only documents I would be filing were postcards to attorney Howard Vance. Garrett had predicted I would rot in a big house alone, but he forgot that I am the one who knows how to organize a clean slate. I might be 62, but I have a new garden to plant by the sea, and a life that is finally, indisputably, and beautifully my own. The lesson I've learned throughout this ordeal is one I hope stays with you. Kindness is a virtue, but it should never be a blindfold. We must love fiercely, but we must also protect the legacy and the hard-earned peace we've built for ourselves. Greed often disguises itself as family, and entitlement can be a slow-acting poison, but the truth, backed by a solid record, is the ultimate antidote. Do not be afraid to stand your ground, even when those you raised are the ones trying to push you off it. Your history belongs to you, and no one has the right to forge your future. Thank you so much for following my journey and standing by me through these difficult times. Your support and comments have been a source of strength when I felt most alone. I truly hope this story provides a valuable lesson for everyone about the importance of protecting your assets and staying vigilant. Please, if this story touched you, like the video, subscribe to the channel and share it with your friends and family so they too can learn from my experience. I would love to hear your thoughts and suggestions in the comments below. Your feedback helps me create even better and more meaningful stories for you in the future. Wishing you all abundant health, luck, and the strength to always protect what is yours. I will see you in the next story.